Welcome to another episode of Well, Don't Tell the Kids. I'm Janet Lee, your host, and today I'm speaking with my guest, Dr. Jennifer Lowe. I wanted to thank you very much for joining me today, Jennifer.
Oh, you're welcome.
Jennifer joins us from the West Coast.
San Francisco Bay Area.
Started off your undergraduate studies at Caltech.
California Institute of Technology.
You studied biology?
Yeah, that's sort of where I ended up.
So where did you start at the freshman year?
I actually, when I was in late elementary school and in middle school, I got really excited about the space program and wanted to be an astronaut. And Caltech has a lot of, obviously, groundbreaking work in astronomy and astrophysics, and they also ran the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And so I wanted to go to Caltech because I thought I wanted to be an astronaut at one point. By the time I got there, I had developed other interests as well and was interested in physics and chemistry, but when I took biology courses there, that's what really ignited my imagination of what I could do in science. And so I ended up majoring in biology, though at that time it was much more of a molecular cellular biology major.
Can you remember the first project or maybe you worked in a professor's lab or something, the first kind of thing that struck your imagination?
Yeah, so when I was at Caltech, one of the opportunities I got was to do an independent research project over the summer, and I'd been introduced to a woman who was changing her lab from doing lymphoma research to breast cancer research. And she was doing this at the City of Hope, which is about 15 minutes away from Caltech. And I drove out there and really hit it off with her. And that was my first real laboratory experience, was working in her lab. It also introduced me to the biomedical field.
Then, like any good biology major, med school had its call.
I had always been exposed to the medical field because my father was a physician. And when I was growing up, I remember, at one point I was looking through one of these picture books where it was like different careers. It was like policemen and firemen and all this stuff. And they always had pictures of the girl and the boy and, in their respective uniforms. And I still remember growing up, there was a page in the book where there was a woman in a nurse outfit and a man in a doctor outfit, and I said, I want to be a nurse, and my dad's like, no, you want to be a doctor. And so that had always been, growing up as a Chinese American woman, that was always sort of in the background, was you're going to be a doctor when you grow up. But like I said, I had these other ambitions. I wanted to be an astronaut. And my father said, fine, you can be an astronaut and a doctor.
How accommodating
when
of
I
him.
When I got to Caltech, I was doing research, and I thought I wanted to be a research scientist. And my mentor, Dr. Wu, she was the one who actually said, she had a PhD, and one of her big regrets was not going to medical school. And she told me, there's these programs now, they're called MD PhD programs, where you have a combined degree. You spend extra years, but it's actually shorter than getting the MD and the PhD separately. But over the course of 6 to 8 years, you can get this combined MD and PhD degree, and that a lot of schools had programs that would actually give you a full scholarship, which in those days, getting a full scholarship to medical school was really something. And so I looked into those programs and ended up applying to an MD PhD programs. But at the time, I had still wanted to be a research scientist. I envisioned myself being a lab bench scientist. But the influences I had at that point were that having that MD degree would provide an additional dimension to thinking about lab and research. And so that's the reason why I chose to do that. But I actually took a year off between going from college to medical school. And part of it was my grades at Caltech. It was a really tough school, and so my grades weren't very good. And I really wanted to be getting some more substantive experience, but I was also given the opportunity to apply for a fellowship. It's called a Thomas J. Watson Fellowship, and that fellowship, it's given by the Thomas J. Watson Foundation. At that point, they were based in Rhode Island, and it was an opportunity for college students graduating from certain member colleges to get what they called a Wanderjahr, a wandering year. And the idea was that you were supposed to spend a year outside the country doing an independent form of exploration and research. You were not supposed to enroll in a school or do a formal study abroad program, but basically you're supposed to spend a year exploring a topic of your choice and gaining a global perspective. And so my application for that program was studying women and the transmission of HIV in countries in Central Africa, Europe, and Asia. The basis for my application was actually a project, an ongoing HIV project in looking at the transmission of HIV in heterosexual couples in Rwanda in Central Africa. And so I went to Rwanda to work with a doctor there named Susan Allen, and she was just phenomenally influential in helping me think about world health policy and about thinking about clinical research. She had set up a clinic in Kigali in which she was treating and seeing women in Kigali. She enrolled a cohort of about 1,500 women and provided them with health care, basic health care for them and their children, and in doing so was able to follow them longitudinally over, I think it was like 6 or 8 years at the end of it, to be able to understand the HIV transmission, the factors affecting HIV transmission, and the diseases that affected women and children with HIV. And this was in the late 80s. At that time in the United States, HIV was considered a disease of gay men and IV drug users, and not much was known about how HIV affected women and children. And so this project was to understand these aspects, and I got to spend time with her in the clinic and basically run errands around the clinic, meet the women, help them with some of their health care needs, like escorting them when they needed surgery, and then just experiencing living in Central Africa. This was before the major genocide in the early 90s. That happened after I left. Yeah, so I spent less than a year in Rwanda, and then I went from there to Singapore and also to Switzerland.
Any obstacles with all the socio-political, the situation there in Rwanda?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it an obstacle so much. I mean, it was very much something you were aware of. The identity cards of the people who worked in the clinic, they all specified which tribe they belonged to. There were physical differences between the Tutsi and Hutu in very general terms. Of course, there were people who were a little more ambiguous in terms of, but there were other people who you could clearly look at and say, okay, that person's Tutsi or that person's Hutu, because it's a very large size difference between these people and in some of their facial features. And the last time there had been this intertribal conflict had been about 20 years before, and so most of the people there had generational memories of the last time there had been a massive conflict.
Or less than a year in Rwanda, and then you mentioned Switzerland and
Singapore. And I'm part of seeing the contrast in the way that the cultural perceptions of HIV transmission, what that meant, how it was prevention of transmission was being addressed, and the cultural phenomenon around thinking about HIV. So, for example, in Singapore, when I was there, like I already told you, the American perception was that this was gay men and IV drug users. In Singapore, the feeling was this was a disease of white people and prostitutes, and so it didn't really affect in their minds, in their opinion, it didn't really affect real Singaporeans. And so as long as you avoided prostitutes and white people, you'd be fine. Central Africa, there were all kinds of rumors about what was causing HIV because it was so prevalent. It was about 30% of the urban population and about 10% of the rural population were HIV positive. And in those days, there were all these myths about how to be treated. There was the belief that Western countries actually had a cure for HIV, or that this was actually a U.S. government conspiracy to kill Africans, that it was developed by the military. There was a rumor at one point that if you had sex with a white woman, you could be cured. And so there was concern. Yeah, so there was a concern that Peace Corps volunteers, for example, were getting raped. There was a rumor going around that the condoms distributed by the Western aid workers actually had HIV, and so if you used a condom distributed by them, that you would get HIV. So there was a lot of rumors and misinformation that were reflecting the cultural biases and superstitions and distrust of the outside world. I mean, this was a place where, colonial powers had already wrought a lot of destruction, and this was sort of an extension of that, I think. That's where these sorts of rumors sort of took root.
You did all of that, and you have not gotten to your medical education yet. So I'm thinking, then did you head to the East Coast?
Yeah, so I did get into the MD-PhD program at Georgetown. I returned to cancer biology research there and did a laboratory PhD and finished my medical school education, and decided after medical school to do a residency in internal medicine. I went to the University of California, Davis, in Sacramento, and so in those days, internal medicine had a way to accelerate the residency through a research pathway as well. And so I did 2 years of internal medicine residency and then moved to the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, back in Washington, D.C., to do an oncology fellowship. And that's the specialized training after internal medicine, that allows one to become an internal medicine oncology physician. And I chose the National Cancer Institute because they had a focus and an extensive training in clinical trials methodology, and the patients that we saw at the National Cancer Institute were all on clinical trial protocols. As part of that training, I also worked as an attending physician at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, and ended up being an attending in the breast cancer clinic there. So those parts of my training, aside from being very scientifically focused and clinical research focused, are pretty traditional for medical training.
So you could have really just gone into a traditional route of more patient-oriented. You also had this equally strong branch for the research. You chose that well.
Yeah, I think, I spent the time in the laboratory, so I have an appreciation for the work that goes into scientific research, and the background that I had during Caltech and my PhD gives me the confidence now to be able to still be able to read the scientific literature and to keep up on methodology. But what I realized was I really loved the aspect of clinical research. And so it is caring for patients, but it's caring for populations of patients in a broader sense as well. And essentially what I moved from is from laboratory research to population research. And that's the way that I see what I'm doing, is marrying the two. I'm right now still, so my career has been in clinical research, and I have, over the course of my career, have brought multiple cancer drugs from being entered into the clinic to getting full approvals and at health authorities around the world, including the FDA. And what I do is still, to me, very fundamentally research in the sense that I formulate hypotheses about how a drug might work and create, and in clinical research, I think even more rigorously than we do in the laboratory, where you can just sort of explore a little bit more. You really have to put down very concrete hypotheses and the statistical methodology to understand them in order to be able to run a clinical trial that's going to be providing meaningful information. And to me, that's incredibly important because patients volunteer their time, their energy. Being in a clinical trial often means doing more things than being in a regular practice as being treated by your doctor as a patient. You may have to come in for additional tests and answer additional questions, have more scans, and then be exposed to drugs that may have additional side effects. And so all of that, to me, it makes it incredibly important that the experiment is well designed so that the patients who participate in these trials are assured that they're contributing to something that's actually going to provide a meaningful answer and advance the science and help other scientists understand how this drug works and how best to either move it forward or not to other patients.
It's interesting that you say that, you took that year off after your undergrad and then went to these different places, and then now you're describing population research. And even further evolving, maybe you could describe a little bit about, it seems like you're helping other entities to go through this process.
Yeah, at this point in my career, I've been fortunate to have had a lot of experience with different drugs and different clinical trial designs and thinking about how to best organize a research endeavor to do this. And so the work that I've done most recently has been to help in large organizations and then in smaller organizations run the clinical research apparatus. 3 years ago, I decided to change the focus of my work. I am now a drug development strategy consultant, and I help CEOs, chief medical officers, investors in the biotech segment understand the clinical development plans that they are pursuing and how to improve them in order to be able to help bring drugs to patients.
You spoke a little bit about NCI and then Genentech, so more pharmaceutical. How long does it take, on average, for this process when it enters the laboratory until it reaches approval to be used in a widespread area? How long does that take, and has that time frame expanded or contracted over the arc of your career?
The process of finding either a molecule or an antibody or whatever that you need to be able to give to people, that's a laboratory process that can take 3 to 5 years, and sometimes longer depending on how complex the science is. But there is a very specific set of criteria that you need to meet in order to be able to bring a drug into people and to be able to test in people for the first time in a phase 1 study. And so that process of developing the biology, the chemistry, the manufacturing process, and then making sure that as far as you can tell in either animal models or cell culture models that it can be considered to be reasonably safe to be tried in people. So that process is one aspect that can be highly variable, but at a minimum takes a couple years, take decades to find the right thing to be able to satisfy all of that. Once it enters into the clinic for the first time in a phase 1 study, that process until it receives its first regulatory approval, that was 7 10, 12, 15 years. That was not at all unusual. One of the first things I did early in my career at Genentech was lead a molecule called a hedgehog pathway inhibitor through to approval, and using my knowledge of the science, my understanding of the regulatory pathway, working with an amazing team at Genentech, we were able to bring that drug into patients from the first day it went into patients to the day that it received its FDA approval. We did that in 5 years and 1 week.
Goodness. Oh, my gosh.
And that, at that time, was one of the fastest approvals of a drug, and was the basis, was part of the basis for some of the thinking that changed at the FDA about how to develop drugs, and they later developed something called a breakthrough designation in order to help accelerate the development of drugs. But so 5 years is on the fast side of this. Some of the drug companies that I've been involved with since then have been able to shave off a little bit of time off of that to 4 years, 3.5 years. And so the fastest at this point, from the first time it enters people to a drug approval, at this point is probably somewhere between 3 and 4 years, or will be in that range. But those are extremely unusual circumstances, and just the right collection of both circumstances, science, population. There has to be a lot of things going into that, and it's certainly not typical. The typical is still somewhere closer to 7 to 10 years. For drugs that are going to be used in a broader population for diseases that for diseases you've heard of, like breast cancer and heart disease and asthma, those are longer because you need to be able to treat much larger numbers of people, like 10,000, 20,000 people, and be able to follow them for at least a couple of years to understand the benefit of your drug as well as the side effect profile. And so those, by definition, end up having to take a much longer period of time. There's no way to shorten those to the 4-year time frames that we do for and just to be clear, the very short ones are usually for extremely rare fatal diseases where you can tell right away whether your drug is working. And because it's such a small population, the risk to the general population is much lower.
You mentioned breakthrough designation. Can you just tell us a little more about that? I wonder.
Oh, the biotech industry. It's a coveted designation. It's a program that the FDA developed in, I think, like 2012, 13, something like that. Maybe plus or minus a year or two. It's a program in which, when you receive this designation by the FDA receives additional funds and resourcing to be able to put more staff on it from their perspective. They meet with the company, the sponsor, more frequently to be able to advise them on a more frequent basis about the drug development, and the purpose of it is to be able to accelerate the speed with which really promising drugs are approved. And in the biotech industry, that breakthrough designation has been a very coveted designation that people like to put out press releases over, because it means that the FDA has recognized that your drug is something that is important, that is worth the extra resources, and will potentially move faster than typical drug development timelines.
Your career spans almost 3 decades.
Maybe even longer, considering how old I am now.
I mean, these are big problems that you're looking at, big challenges. Do you see things changing, the arc moving towards, I like to say solution, but changing for the better?
Oh, most definitely changing for the better. I think that, there's always, pluses and minuses in the way any industry develops, but and I'm sad that the pharmaceutical industry has reached apparently a new nadir in terms of its reputation. But I feel like the research enterprise that is going on and the way that pharmaceutical science is contributing to the research, to creating drugs for new diseases, finding new ways to think about disease and how to combat that. I mean, that it's so competitive right now. There's so much going on there. The breakthroughs and the news that comes out of all of these health conferences where this data is reported. I mean, it seems to be accelerating. There's so much now that that exists. People's prognosis and lifespans have been increasing, and so from a purely scientific research perspective, I think there's tons to be optimistic about in terms of the way that we're thinking about health research and combating disease. But I think that the pharmaceutical industry is also justifiably getting a lot of criticism for the way that it has been operationalizing a lot of this and the way that it's funding a lot of this, and that that there's just so much that's going on the fringes, but gets the attention of regulators and Wall Street, and in terms of how drugs are priced and how disparities are addressed and how patients have access to drugs, and how our healthcare system in general is making drugs and treatments available to people. I think there's a huge amount of improvement that needs to be done there, and is there badness there that is reflective of the same sort of disparities that are growing with income gaps, and I see there's a lot of parallels to other global problems. But I think if you just look at the microcosm around research that's being done into health issues and benefits and new discoveries that are being made that could potentially be turned into medicines and that have been turned into medicines, that's I'm very pleased and optimistic about and really proud of what I've done to participate in that aspect of it. And that is what I use to focus, what I do and how I frame, what I do and what I enjoy doing. But I'm not blind to the fact that there's a lot of issues and problems still.
Shifting gears slightly, I'm wondering if you have any specific advice to give to the young who are looking at the fields of medicine, research, but especially towards women or young women, how to get in, stay in, and advance. Do you have any insight on that?
So the first thing is, the career that I have now, I'm not sure I could have necessarily imagined when I was in high school or even in college. And I have a daughter now who is a senior in high school, is a scientist. She probably wants to go into engineering, but the advice that I give to her at this point is, if you're scientifically inclined, if you have a gift for math and science in general, don't worry about what field you want to go into. What I tell her is that she should be trying to increase her knowledge base, increase her understanding as broadly as she can, as deeply as she can in the areas that she finds interesting, and understand that this knowledge base is going to serve her well throughout her career. And it doesn't matter at this point whether she wants to be, as she's expressed, she wants to be an engineer on the Mars program, or whether she wants to, for example, maybe wants to go into patent law in the future, or maybe she'll want to be a physician someday, there's just so many different possibilities of things that she could do in the future, and not to worry about that and not to limit herself in that thinking. There's a narrative that we all have to be able to talk about our lives, and right now she's applying to colleges, and so she is honing that narrative of, this is who I am and this is what I want to do on one hand, but on the other hand, she can change her mind later, right? As she learns more in college, she may decide that she wants to go to either a professional school or further study, or she may, join some amazing startup that is, really involved in, robotics or something that she has a passion for. And she may do that for a while and then decide, actually she wants to move into micro-robotics or something different, or go back to law school or something. And I think that having a really solid science background and a willingness to pursue your interests, there will be fields and things that you'll discover that you can be passionate about. And that may last for a few years, that may last for, a decade, it may last your entire life. But you should feel free to continue to explore the things you want to do. And as long as you're amassing knowledge and experience, those experiences and knowledge will help you in the next stage of whatever it is that you're going to do. And so to be open to changing what you're doing, to building on what you have, and pursuing it in a direction that you want. And the nice thing about the sciences right now is that, for the most part, they're valued to the point where, you can make a good living, and so you can move around and do what you want. And so people shouldn't be afraid of changing their focus either, or, deciding that, they've been micro-focused on a particular field for their PhD. You can go somewhere else and do something else. And the skill set, the general knowledge that you've gained is always going to be useful. So that's my advice for that part, because I've been talking to my daughter a lot about that. In terms of being a woman, what I see, my daughter's generation, they don't feel as much the overt sexism that I think even people of my generation have. And certainly we didn't as much as, the generation before. So I do think that there are a lot of things that have gotten better, but in a lot of ways it's become more subtle, and it's harder to put your finger on something. And so there may still be the perception that, well, there can only be a few women at the top, and so I have to compete with other women to make myself distinguished. And I wish that wasn't the case, but I still feel like that does exist. And I would love to see that go away, that you're no longer part of a token minority, either because of your race or your gender or your sexual orientation, or that you would be considered, well, we can have one person like this. But I think it's a pressure that we all of us who are in minorities still experience, and there is the pressure that we have when we are given a role or responsibility that somehow we represent all of that, the baggage that comes with it, that gender, that, if we don't succeed, then it gets blamed on, like, oh, well, I knew I shouldn't have put a woman in this position, or I shouldn't have put an Asian person in this position, or they always do X. And so it's a lot of pressure still, I think, especially at the highest levels, and it's still pretty prevalent, and it's unfortunate. And I mean, that's one of the hardest things for me to talk to my daughter about, is that I think when you're younger, you haven't experienced that as much on the, at the entry levels, and so it's easy to think that it doesn't still exist. But I think that, for people of my generation, my era, who are near the tops of corporate ladders, it does exist, and it's hard, and so I absolutely want more diversity and more women and more people of all races and sexual orientations. And I want that diversity so that the pressure on each of us who are becomes less. More people are allowed to succeed and fail, but we still have a ways to go with that.
I think that there's definitely many eyes on the problem from many different directions. Like a structural, systemic kind of look at it that way. I hear a lot about mentoring, helping each other. I'd like to see these things a lot stronger.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have done throughout my career is I've not worried so much about the ideas in particular so much as the people that I'm working with, and that has been more important. So even though I had, for example, a background in some breast cancer research that I did in college, when I went to work for labs for my PhD, I focused on the people that I was working with. I picked good mentors based on their reputations for being supportive of their graduate students, providing their graduate students with good projects. I didn't worry so much about the quality of the project as I did about the people that I'd be working with, feeling like I could bring the quality, I could, adjust that part. And I saw other people who say, I need to absolutely work on, microtubule stabilization in Drosophila cells or something like this. And I think that that's very short-sighted because, science is constantly changing. The things that may appeal to you are constantly changing. But the people in your path and the people who are going to support you as you move forward end up being much more critical to your career as a whole. I would say be very careful about who you work for. If you get warning signs in the back of your head that maybe this person is not going to be as supportive or helpful or shows, inappropriate attention or something, that take those as warning signs and find somebody better. And so that's the way that I've lived my life in the past. And I think that part of my success has been because I focused on the people that I work with and not so much the subject matter itself. And then similarly, it's never too early to be reaching back and helping the people behind you. And so, as a high school student, you can be helping middle schoolers, and you can be encouraging and helping as a female student, helping other female students to be able to see role models. And so, for example, my daughter is captain of the robotics team, but all through her period on the robotics team, she's always been keeping an eye out on helping younger students and bringing them up through the ranks, and that's part of what has helped her establish her leadership experience and now credentials. And that is sort of the counter side to mentoring, right? We always say, you need to find good mentors, especially as women. You need to find sponsors. You need to find people who are going to support you. But I also would remind women that you need to look back, too. You need to pull people through back with you. It enhances your credibility as a leader and a mentor. But, we tend to discount ourselves and say, I don't really have anything to offer yet. I'm still too young. But you're not, because, you already have, more experience than a person 1 year younger than you, right? Or 1 year, less in the job than you have.
Be a mentor.
Be a mentor, and you learn a tremendous amount that way too. And so I do think it's really important to, even when you feel like you're too young, to mentor others, to help others. How did you get a job at this company? How did you, even if you've just started, how did you, and as you move around, as you advance through your career, you need to constantly looking backward and seeing, who else looks promising, who else can you help develop, who else can you bring through with you, because these people will support you later. So you look both forward and backwards. Okay. You look for good people in front of you, but you also look for good people behind you too. They may end up being your boss at some point.
This is true. I hope that the folks in the audience find it interesting, but especially the younger set.
Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for sharing your perspective.
Well, you're very welcome.
That's about all the time we have for now. My guest has been Dr. Jennifer Lowe.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you all for listening. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Well, Don't Tell the Kids.